The silence in the archive hall was the kind that had weight, not the comfortable silence of a library at midday, warm and dust-moted and full of the small sounds of turning pages, but the silence of a place that had been forgotten deliberately, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as though afraid of what memories it might disturb if it moved too freely. Sarah had grown accustomed to that silence over the 3 years she had spent cataloging the lower records of the Obsidian Palace, and she had come to think of it as the only honest thing in a building full of beautiful, carefully constructed lies. She was on her knees beside a collapsed shelf when she heard the sound. Not a footstep. Not the creak of the ancient wooden door at the far end of the corridor. Something lower than that. Something that bypassed her ears entirely and landed somewhere in the center of her chest. A vibration more than a sound. The kind of thing her body registered before her mind had any chance to name it. She stopped moving. Her hands, which had been carefully gathering a scattered stack of parchment scrolls, went still against the stone floor. The candlelight around her flickered once, as though something large had displaced the air nearby, and then settled back into its steady amber glow. Sarah told herself it was nothing. She was good at telling herself things were nothing. She had been doing it her entire life, practicing the particular discipline of a woman who has learned that drawing attention to her own fear is more dangerous than the fear itself. She gathered the last of the scrolls, set them carefully on the nearest intact shelf, and stood. She brushed the dust from her plain gray dress with methodical hands. She did not look toward the far end of the corridor. She did not need to look. She already knew in that wordless way that lives below reason that something was already looking at her. "You should not be down here," she said. Because saying something, ordinary in an extraordinary moment, had always been her particular form of courage. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that, at least. The corridor stretched ahead of her, lit at intervals by iron sconces whose flames all bent simultaneously toward the left, as though drawn by something beyond the reach of the candlelight. The lower archive is restricted to staff with a level 4 clearance. If you have come for the Draven census records, those have been moved to the East Wing, 3rd floor, room 14. If you have come for anything else, I am afraid I cannot help you tonight. Nothing answered her. And then the shadow at the end of the corridor moved. It was not a man's silhouette. That was the first thing she registered, and the information arrived with a strange, crystalline clarity, the way important truths sometimes do, without drama or distortion, simply present and undeniable. It was far too large for a man. It moved the way liquid moves when it is poured, all weight and fluid inevitability, no hesitation in any part of its motion, and as it came closer, step by careful step, Sarah became aware of 2 things in rapid succession. The first was that she should be running. The second was that her legs had made a different decision entirely, and had no intention of moving at all. The panther that emerged from the shadow into the candlelight was the largest creature she had ever seen in her life. Black as ink poured over obsidian, its coat absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, so that it seemed less like an animal in a room and more like a piece of the darkness itself that had decided to take a shape and walk. Its eyes were the exception. They caught the candlelight and held it, burning amber gold in the black of its face, and they were fixed on her with an attention so complete, so total, that Sarah felt the peculiar sensation of being truly seen for the first time in recent memory. She did not scream. She wanted to note that to herself, later, when she had the luxury of looking back on this moment. She did not scream, and she did not run, and she did not reach for the small ceremonial knife she kept at her belt out of habit, rather than any genuine expectation of danger. She stood in the flickering candlelight of the lower archive and watched the panther walk toward her with those burning amber eyes, and she thought, with the detached clarity of a person in shock, that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from its body, could hear the low, rhythmic sound of its breathing, could see the slight rise and fall of that enormous chest. Close enough that if it chose to, it could have ended her before she drew her next breath. It did not choose to. Instead, It did something that she would spend the next several weeks turning over in her mind, examining from every angle, unable to make it fit into any framework. She possessed. The panther lowered its head, not in the way a predator lowers its head before a strike, compressing power before release. It lowered its head slowly, deliberately, the way something enormous and certain of its own power lowers its head to acknowledge something it has chosen to acknowledge. And the gesture was so unmistakably intentional that Sarah felt her throat close with an emotion she could not immediately name. She raised her hand. She did not decide to do this. Her arm simply rose, the way a compass needle swings toward north, drawn by something it has no language to explain, and her fingers made contact with the panther's forehead, and the world went white. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She did not tell anyone what had happened in the lower archive. This was not a difficult decision. Sarah had spent enough years in the Obsidian Palace to understand the precise mechanics of how information moved through its halls, how a rumor became a story, became an accusation in the time it took for one person to whisper a thing into another person's ear. She was already barely tolerated here. The daughter of a minor counselor who had died in debt, kept on as archive staff out of what she suspected was a combination of institutional inertia and the fact that no one else wanted the job of cataloging records that were centuries old and written in 3 dead languages. She could not afford to be the woman who claimed to have encountered the king's famously uncontrollable panther aspect in the lower archive and survived. They would either think her a liar or think her something stranger than that. Neither option appealed to her. She went back to her quarters in the servants' wing, washed the archive dust from her hands, ate the modest supper that had been left outside her door, and sat for a long time by her small window looking out at the palace grounds without seeing them. Her right hand, the one that had touched the panther's forehead, felt different. Not painful. Not exactly warm. Simply aware, in a way that hands are not generally aware, as though it had received information through that contact that her mind had not yet been given permission to process. She pressed it flat against the cold stone of the windowsill and tried to remember everything she knew about the king. King Cale Draven was 34 years old and had held the throne for 8 years, since the death of his father under circumstances that were still discussed in careful, lowered voices in certain parts of the palace. He was 6 feet 4 inches of what the court ladies described in breathy, scandalized whispers as controlled devastation, a phrase Sarah had always found both ridiculous and accurate in the same measure, because she had seen him from a distance precisely twice, and both times had found herself understanding, despite her best efforts not to, why the phrase existed. He governed with a precision that bordered on the inhuman, which most people found terrifying and a small number found admirable, and he had not taken a mate in the 8 years of his reign despite the mounting political pressure to do so. His panther aspect, the dual nature that marked him as one of the rarest of the lichen bloodlines, a king who carried both wolf and panther in his lineage, had been considered under control until approximately 6 months ago, when something had changed, and the whispers in the servants' halls had begun. The panther did not obey him anymore. That was the whisper. That was the thing being said in careful, incomplete sentences behind hands and behind closed doors. The king could still shift, could still command the wolf aspect that formed the public, political face of his supernatural nature, but the panther was something older and wilder and less interested in political necessity, and it had begun to slip the bonds that kept it contained, disappearing from the warded chambers where the king retreated when the pressure of rulership became something that required the release of form, and reappearing hours later in places it should not have been able to access. 3 weeks ago, it had reportedly been found in the throne room at dawn, seated on the dais with every appearance of having been there all night, simply waiting. The palace mages had been called. The king had declined their help with what witnesses described as a controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than open anger. And now it had found her in the lower archive and bowed its head. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold glass of her window and breathed slowly, and told herself, with the firm, practiced voice she used for self-instruction, that this was not about her. Animals behaved strangely sometimes, even supernatural animals of ancient and royal lineage. It did not mean anything. She was going to go to sleep, and in the morning she was going to go back to the archive and catalog the remaining records from the pre-Dravon era, and she was absolutely not going to think about amber gold eyes that had looked at her as though she were the only fixed point in a turning world. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. The morning brought Lady Isadora Vielle to the archive, which was the first warning Sarah should have taken seriously. Isadora never came to the archive. No one of her station came to the archive. The lower records were the domain of Dust and Silence and Sarah, and the occasional junior scholar who arrived with the specific narrow focus of someone looking for a single document and retreated the moment they had it, back to the inhabited, perfumed upper floors of the palace, where the air smelled of beeswax candles and political ambition, rather than of ancient parchment and stone. Isadora Vielle, who was the heir to the northern Vielle territories, and the woman the court had been, assuming for the past year would be announced as the king's intended mate before the season was out, had no reason to be in the lower archive at 7 a.m, standing in the doorway with her silver blonde hair arranged in its customary architectural perfection, and her pale gray eyes moving with careful assessment around the room before they settled on Sarah. "You are the archivist," she said. It was not a question. It was the particular kind of statement that people make when they already know the answer, and are assessing whether you know that they know. "I am the assistant archivist," Sarah said, which was technically accurate, and also, she recognized dimly, a reflex of deflection so deeply ingrained she had done it without thinking. "The senior archivist, Master Coven, manages the upper collection. I manage the lower records." "Yes," Isadora said. She moved into the room with the fluid precision of a woman who had been trained since childhood to move through spaces as though she owned them regardless of the legal reality. She wore deep blue today, a color that on anyone else would have looked cold, and on her looked deliberate, a statement. She stopped at the edge of Sarah's current workspace and looked at the spread of documents on the table with an expression that was too neutral to be casual. "I am told you have been cataloging the pre-convergence era records." Sarah kept her expression even. "I have been, yes. It is a large collection. Many of the documents had not been touched in over 2 centuries. She paused. "Is there something specific you are looking for? I can direct you to the index if you would like, or if there is a particular family line or event that you are researching. I may be able to narrow the search considerably." Isadora's gaze moved from the documents to Sarah's face, and Sarah had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being measured. "I am told," Isadora said, each word placed with deliberate care, "that there are records in this collection pertaining to the old bloodline classifications, the ones that predate the Dravon consolidation." "There are," Sarah said carefully. "And have you found anything of particular interest in those records?" The question was phrased casually. Everything about Isadora was phrased casually. Sarah, who had survived 3 years in this palace by becoming very good at hearing what was not being said, heard the sharpness underneath it like a blade wrapped in silk. "I have found a great deal of interesting material," Sarah said. "The pre-convergence bloodline records are extraordinarily detailed. The classification system they used was considerably more nuanced than what we use today." She met Isadora's eyes with the pleasant, unhelpful expression she had spent years perfecting. "Is there a specific bloodline you are interested in researching? I would be happy to assist." The 2 women looked at each other for a moment in the candlelit silence of the lower archive, and something passed between them that was not quite a conversation, but was unmistakably a declaration of some kind. And then Isadora smiled, which was more alarming than anything else she had done, and said, "I will let you know," and left. Sarah waited until her footsteps had faded entirely before she allowed herself to breathe properly. Then she turned back to her workbench and looked at the document she had, in fact, been studying for the past 2 weeks. The parchment was old enough that she handled it with preservation gloves, and the text was written in a dialect of the old tongue that had taken her the better part of a month to translate with any confidence. She had been treating her translation as a scholarly exercise, the kind of quiet intellectual pleasure that sustained her through the more tedious aspects of her work. She had not yet allowed herself to think seriously about what it might mean. The document was a bloodline classification record from the era before the Draven kings had consolidated power across the territories. It described, in the careful, systematic language of a scribe who believed in precision above all things, the characteristics of a lineage that had been thought lost, a lineage that carried both wolf and panther in its blood, not as alternating aspects, the way the Draven line did, father to son in a neat succession of either one or the other, but simultaneously, woven together at the root, both present in the same body at the same time. The record called this lineage the Sarah line, which had made her feel strange the first time she read it, a coincidence that she had firmly declined to find meaningful, and noted that it had last been documented 300 years before, at the time of the Great Purge that had preceded the Draven consolidation. The last entry in the record was a notation that the line had been extinguished. Sarah had, in the privacy of her own mind, begun to suspect that this was not entirely accurate. She was still thinking about this 3 hours later, when the door at the far end of the corridor opened and the king of all Lycan territories walked into the lower archive. She knew it was him before she looked up. There was something about the quality of the air when he entered a space, a shift in pressure that she suspected had nothing to do with anything metaphysical and everything to do with the particular force of his presence. The way certain people carry authority in their bodies so completely that a room rearranges itself around them before anyone has consciously registered that they are there. She had felt it from 50 feet away at the 2 formal court events she had attended in her capacity as a staff member, and she felt it now at a distance of perhaps 15 feet, concentrated and immediate and impossible to pretend she was not feeling. She set down her translation pen. She stood. She turned. He was exactly what she remembered from a distance and entirely different close-up, which was the most unsettling thing about him. The controlled devastation the court ladies whispered about was real, but it was not, as she had privately theorized, primarily a matter of physical features, though those were certainly present and accounted for. It was the eyes. They were amber gold, the same color as the Panther's. She had known this, intellectually, in the abstract way she knew things from records and reports. She had not known it the way she knew it now, standing 8 feet away from him, while he looked at her with eyes that she had last seen in a black-furred face bent in what she could only call deference, and she felt something happen in her chest that she had absolutely no framework for, and filed, with considerable haste, under things to examine later when she was not currently being looked at by the king. "Your Majesty," she said, and executed the bow that was required of her. And when she straightened, she kept her expression precisely as neutral as it had been when Isadora had stood in this same spot 3 hours before, which cost her considerably more effort this time. "You are the archivist who manages the pre-convergence collection," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, or perhaps she had simply never been close enough to hear it properly before. It carried the same quality as his presence, something measured and dense, like a river that has learned to move without showing how deep it runs. "Assistant archivist," she said, and then stopped. Herself, because she had done the deflection twice in one morning, and she was not going to make it a habit. "Yes, I manage the lower records." He looked at her for a moment, with those amber gold eyes in that measuring way, and she had the peculiar and uncomfortable sensation that he was looking for something specific, and had found it, and was now deciding what to do with the finding. "Did something happen in this archive last night?" he said. Sarah held his gaze. This was the moment. She understood, where one path diverged into two. She could say no, nothing happened, and that would be a lie that both of them would know was a lie, and they would continue on from that lie in whatever direction such things led. Or she could tell the truth, which was considerably riskier. And also, she recognized with some resignation, the only thing she was actually willing to do, because she had survived her years in this palace by never letting anyone catch her in a lie. And she was not going to. Start with the king. Yes, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, barely anything. But she was watching for it, and she caught it. Tell me what happened, he said. She told him. She used the clean, precise language she used for translation work, factual and sequential, without embellishment or interpretation. She described the sound she had heard, the shadow at the end of the corridor, the animal that had emerged from it, the moment of stillness, the gesture, the contact. She described her hand rising without her conscious decision to raise it. She described the flash of white. She did not describe the emotion she had felt in the moment the panther had bowed its head, because some things are private, even when you are being entirely truthful, and because she did not yet have adequate language for it anyway. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to have texture. You are not afraid, he said. I was afraid, she said honestly. I am afraid now. If we are being accurate about it, I am simply better at managing it than most people assume. Something changed in the quality of the silence. She could not have said precisely what changed, only that the room felt different in its aftermath, the way the air feels different after lightning, but before the sound of thunder arrives. He looked at her with those amber gold eyes for another moment, and then he said something she was completely unprepared for. Have you found anything in the pre-convergence bloodline records that pertains to a lineage called Sarah? Her heart did something complicated. She made sure none of that complication reached her face. I have, she said. I have been translating the primary classification document for the past 2 weeks. It is in Old Tongue, 3rd dialect, which is not commonly read. I should have a complete translation within the week. I need it sooner than that, he said. I can have a preliminary translation by tomorrow morning. She said. He nodded once, the way people nod when they are already thinking past the thing they are nodding about. He turned to leave. He stopped. He turned back, and she had the impression that whatever he was about to say next was not the kind of thing he said often or easily. My panther, he said, has not acknowledged another person in 8 years of life outside my own body. I need you to understand that what happened last night is not a small thing. I understand, she said. I do not think. You do yet, he said, but you will. He left, and the archive was quiet again, and Sarah sat down on her stool very carefully and placed both hands flat on the workbench and breathed until the various systems of her body that had staged a minor revolt at some point during the last 10 minutes returned to something resembling their normal operational state. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. She had the preliminary translation ready by that evening, which required her to work through her supper hour and well into the period she normally spent reading. But she had found that the urgency of the task clarified her thinking in a way that the detached pace of scholarly work sometimes did not. There was something about working toward a specific answer, rather than simply working toward completeness, that sharpened her focus. And she found herself moving through the Old Tongue text with a facility she had not known she possessed until she needed it, as though some additional fluency had been unlocked by the pressure of the situation and the specific amber gold weight of the king's gaze. The bloodline record described the Sarah lineage in terms that were both clinical and, once translated fully, startling. The dual nature, wolf and panther woven together in a single inheritance, was characterized not as an aberration, but as an original state, the old scribe noted with careful scholarly emphasis, suggesting that what was now considered two distinct supernatural inheritances had once been a single unified gift, and that the Sarah bloodline represented the last living remnant of that original unity. The purge 3 centuries past had been specifically targeted, the record noted, with the kind of flat, administrative language that makes terrible things sound bureaucratic. A political decision. A consolidation of power that required the elimination of anything that complicated the clean lines of the new order. But the record also noted something else. A property of the dual inheritance that made it impossible to fully destroy even through the most systematic effort. The bloodline did not express itself consistently in every generation. It could recede, lying dormant in a lineage for 2 or 3 generations, emerging only when the genetic conditions were precisely right, and when it did emerge, it did not always announce itself through obvious supernatural ability. Sometimes, the record noted, the inheritance was carried by someone who appeared, for all ordinary purposes, to be entirely human. Someone who might spend years in proximity to the supernatural world without ever triggering the recognition response of another supernatural being. Until something woke it. Until something recognized it when the carrier themselves had no idea there was anything to recognize. Sarah sat for a long time after she finished reading that passage, not translating, not making notes, simply sitting with the strange, echoing quality of the silence that surrounds a truth you have been not quite knowing for a long time and have finally stopped being able to avoid. Her mother had been human. At least, that was what she had always been told. Her father, the minor counselor who had left her his name and his debts and very little else, had been low-ranking lichen, wolf-blooded and unremarkable. There had never been any indication, in all the 26 years of her life, that she was anything other than what she appeared to be. A half-blood with no wolf of her own, no access to the supernatural inheritance that even the lowest-ranked full lichen carried, a woman who existed at the edges of a world she was adjacent to but not part of. She had accepted this the way she had accepted most of the conditions of her life. Not happily, but practically, with the understanding that acceptance was not the same as surrender. She thought about the moment her hand had risen without her deciding to raise it. She thought about the white flash behind her eyes when her fingers had touched the Panther's forehead. She thought about the way her body had known, before her mind had any information at all, that something large was in the corridor, and had stood still rather than running, as though some older, deeper part of her had recognized a situation in which running would be both unnecessary and wrong. She gathered the translated document and the original parchment carefully, wrapped them both in preservation cloth, and carried them upstairs. The king's private study was on the 4th floor of the East Wing, which she had been to precisely once before, when she had been summoned to deliver a specific set of treaty documents to a secretary who met her at the door and took them from her hands without inviting her inside. Tonight, the door was opened by the king himself, which suggested either that he had been expecting her specifically or that he had dismissed his staff, and when she stepped inside and saw that the large, quietly furnished room contained only the 2 of them and the low fire burning in the hearth, she understood that it was probably both. She laid the documents on his desk and talked him through her translation, with the same clean, precise language she had used that morning, working through the text section by section, pausing to note where her interpretation might have multiple valid readings and where she was confident in her translation's accuracy. He listened without interrupting, which she was grateful for because interruptions disrupted her systematic thinking, and he looked at the original text occasionally with the expression of someone following along in a language they know imperfectly but well enough to verify the general shape of what is being said. When she reached the passage about the dormant expression of the lineage, she stopped. She was aware that he had stopped looking at the document and was now looking at her. She kept her eyes on the text. The record indicates, she said, with careful, measured words, that the lineage can be carried in a latent form by someone with no apparent supernatural expression. A half-blood, for example, who appears to carry only the lower-ranking inheritance of one parent, might in fact be carrying the dormant Sarah bloodline through a lineage that does not appear in any modern records. She paused. Because the records from the original Sarah line were systematically destroyed during the purge, it would be effectively impossible to trace living descendants through conventional genealogical means. But not impossible to identify them through other means, he said. She looked up at him then, because there was no longer any productive pretense to maintain. Not impossible, she agreed. If another supernatural being with a connection to the old bloodlines were to encounter a dormant carrier, the recognition response would activate regardless of what the carrier believed about their own inheritance. She held his gaze. I assume that is what you came to tell me this morning. that your panther recognized something. My panther has not responded to any person since the first time I lost control of it, he said, and his voice was still that measured, dense thing. But there was something different underneath it now that she had not heard this morning, something she suspected he did not often allow to surface. It disappeared from the warded chambers 6 months ago, and has not permitted me to control its movements since. It goes where it chooses. It acknowledges nothing and no one. Until last night. Sarah set down the translation documents. She looked at the fire. She thought very carefully about what she was going to say next, because she was aware that she was standing in the king's private study late in the evening, with a revelation that had implications she was only beginning to fully understand, and the careful, self-protective part of her that had kept her alive and employed in this palace for 3 years was sending a very clear signal that this was a moment requiring extraordinary precision. Your Majesty, she said, if the bloodline record is accurate, and if your panther's response to me is what the record would suggest it is, then what we are discussing is the possibility that I carry the Sarah inheritance in a dormant form. That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary claim about my origins that I have no way to verify, and that would have considerable political implications if it were known. She paused. Considerable and immediate implications given the current political situation. She did not say Isadora's name. She did not need to. He was quiet for a moment. Isadora came to the archive today, he said. She did. What did she want? She asked about the pre-convergence bloodline records, Sarah said. She was careful not to be specific. I was careful not to give her anything specific, but she knew enough to ask, which means she has had access to information about what I have been researching, and she came in person to assess the situation herself. She looked at him steadily. She is very intelligent and very motivated. I would not underestimate the speed at which she can move when she has identified a threat. Are you a threat? He said. He asked it without any particular inflection, genuinely curious. And she found that she liked him, suddenly and unexpectedly, for that quality, for the willingness to ask a thing directly, rather than circling it the way most powerful people circled things they wanted to know. I do not know yet, she said honestly. I think that depends considerably on what the bloodline record says about the ceremony of blood binding, which is the section I have not yet fully translated. She met his eyes. I think I need to finish that translation as quickly as possible. I agree, he said. I think you should do it here, where the document is secure and where I can be available if questions arise. It was the most careful, politically neutral way she had ever heard anyone suggest that she should not leave his immediate vicinity, and she recognized, with something that was not quite amusement and not quite anything else she could name, that this was probably as close as a king came to saying something openly protective, and she appreciated the effort, even as she noted the way her own response to it complicated her previously simple view of her own situation. She stayed. She translated. The ceremony of blood binding, as described in the ancient record, was a ritual performed once per generation at the turning of the midwinter moon, in which the true mate of the ruling king would be revealed through the convergence of blood and ancient power in a way that bypassed all human decision and political negotiation entirely. The ceremony required the presence of all eligible females in the court, and worked through a process of elimination that the old scribe described with calm and slightly alarming precision. Each woman who participated would offer a drop of blood to the sacred vessel, and the vessel would respond to each offering with either silence or recognition. And if recognition came, it would come in a form that was impossible to misinterpret and impossible to dispute, because the old magic that governed it had been designed specifically to prevent the kind of political manipulation that had apparently been a recurring problem even in the era before the Dravon consolidation. The record noted, in its final section, that the ceremony was particularly significant for bloodlines that carried a dual inheritance, because in such cases, the recognition was not merely acknowledged by the vessel, but amplified through the supernatural nature of the lineage itself, creating a manifestation of the dormant inheritance that could not be hidden or explained away. Sarah stared at that last passage for a long time. Then she looked at the date notation at the top of the page that indicated when the next ceremony was scheduled according to the old calendar. Then she looked at the calendar on the king's desk. "Your Majesty," she said very carefully, "when is the midwinter gathering?" 3 weeks from tomorrow," he said, without looking up from the correspondence he had been working through while she translated. "The blood-binding ceremony," she said. "Has it been scheduled for this gathering?" He did look up then. His amber gold eyes met hers across the width of the desk, and in them she saw something that told her he had already known, before she asked, exactly what the translation was going to reveal. "It was announced last month," he said. "Isadora requested it formally, through the council. She has been preparing for it for some time." The political architecture of what was happening assembled itself in Sarah's mind with the cold, clear speed of a structure she had already been building piece by piece, without realizing she was building it. Isadora had known about the bloodline record. Isadora had known or suspected that something in the lower archive had information relevant to the ceremony. Isadora had come personally to assess how much the assistant archivist had discovered and whether she could be contained or neutralized before the ceremony took place. And Isadora had requested the ceremony herself, which meant either that she was supremely confident in its outcome, or that she had found a way to influence it, or both. "The record says the ceremony cannot be manipulated," Sarah said slowly. "Records say many things," the king replied. "What I know about Isadora Vielle is that she does not request things she does not believe she can control." They looked at each other in the firelight, the king and the assistant archivist. And Sarah thought about the panther bowing its head in the candlelit corridor, and about her hand rising without her decision, and about the white flash that had felt less like a shock, and more like something opening. And she thought that whatever was coming was already in motion, and had been for longer than either of them had realized. "I need to finish the translation," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do." She was still there when the palace clock struck 3 a.m, and she did not notice. The next 2 weeks had a quality she would later describe to herself as the texture of held breath. The palace moved through its normal rhythms of court function and political maneuvering and seasonal preparation for the midwinter gathering. And on the surface nothing had changed, and beneath the surface everything had. Sarah moved through those 2 weeks in a state of heightened awareness that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unpleasant, the way it feels to carry a secret that has weight and warmth rather than simply weight alone. She had completed the translation. She and the king had discussed it at length over 3 subsequent evenings in his private study. Evenings that had started with the formality of a working relationship and had gradually acquired a different quality, one that she was careful about naming, but could not pretend she did not notice. He was rigorous and precise in his thinking, which she found unexpectedly companionable, because she was those things too, and most people found it exhausting. He did not simplify his language when he spoke to her, which she noticed because she was accustomed to people simplifying their language for her and had learned not to mind it too much. He listened to her interpretations with genuine attention, rather than the performative attention of someone waiting for her to finish so they could speak. He was also, she had discovered, funnier than she expected, in the very dry, very quiet way of someone who has spent years in the company of people who take themselves seriously and has developed humor as a private survival mechanism. She had laughed, genuinely and unexpectedly, at something he said on the, 3rd evening, and the surprise on his face at the sound of it was almost immediately replaced by something else, something warmer and more complicated, and she had looked back down at her translation work with the focused attention of someone who needs very badly to be looking at something other than what they are actually thinking about. The panther came again on the 9th day. She was alone in the archive, as she almost always was, and it did not come from the shadows this time, but through the door, which it opened with the confidence of something that has decided a door is not an obstacle, and it settled in the far corner of the room with the particular quality of presence that very large, very certain things have, and simply stayed there while she worked. She told herself she did not feel immediately and irrationally safer. She was not entirely successful. "You cannot keep coming here," she told it without looking up from her work, because it seemed important to maintain some form of professional decorum, even when speaking to a supernatural panther of royal lineage. People will notice. People are already noticing things they should not be noticing, and I would prefer not to add to the list of evidence currently being assembled by individuals with hostile intentions. The panther made a sound that was not quite a purr and not quite a growl, and was entirely too expressive for an animal that was supposedly operating on instinct rather than comprehension. "I know," she said, which surprised her, because she had not known she was going to say it until she did, and it was unclear what she knew exactly, except that something had shifted in her understanding of her own situation, in a way that was no longer deniable, and she thought the panther knew what she meant better than she did. "I know. But we have 3 weeks, and I need to think very carefully about what I'm going to do about it. And I cannot do that if you are sitting in the corner looking at me with those eyes." The panther looked at her with those eyes for another hour, and then left the same way it had come, and Sarah went back to her work with the particular focus of someone who is concentrating very hard on one thing in order to avoid concentrating on another. Isadora called her to a private meeting on the 11th day. The summons came in the form of a written note, impeccably worded in the formal court style, requesting the pleasure of Sarah's company for afternoon tea in the Lady Vielle's private receiving room, and it was so perfectly constructed as to be impossible to decline without constituting a political offense that Sarah would not be able to afford. She went. Isadora's receiving room was everything the lower archive was not. Warm, light, furnished with the kind of beautiful objects that announce their expense without advertising it. It smelled of fresh flowers and a particular perfume that Sarah suspected was calibrated as precisely as everything else about Isadora. The lady herself was seated near the window, dressed in a warm ivory that managed to look both understated and magnificent, and she received Sarah with a warmth that was also, beneath its surface, calibrated to the last degree. "Sit down, please," Isadora said, and her voice was the trained warmth of someone who has learned to make people feel welcomed, precisely long enough to be useful. "I hope the walk-up was not too tiring. I understand you have been keeping rather long hours in the archive. Research does not always accommodate convenient scheduling," Sarah said pleasantly, and sat, and accepted the tea that was offered, and settled into the careful, precise attention that had kept her employed and unremarkable in this palace for 3 years. They talked, for the first 20 minutes, about nothing that mattered. The preparations for the midwinter gathering, the expected guest list, the weather, which had turned cold early this year. Isadora was accomplished at this. The generation of warmth and ease through the careful accumulation of small, inconsequential exchanges, and Sarah let it happen and waited for the moment when the architecture shifted, as she knew it would, because Isadora had not invited her here for tea. "I wanted to speak with you," Isadora said, when the tea had been poured twice and the pleasantries had run their natural course, "about the blood-binding ceremony." She set down her cup and looked at Sarah with those pale gray eyes that were suddenly entirely direct. "I know that you have been translating the original documentation. I imagine, given your obvious intelligence, that you have drawn certain conclusions from what you found. I have translated a historical document," Sarah said carefully. "The conclusions I draw are scholarly in nature." "Of course," Isadora said. She smiled, and it was a beautiful smile, and it did not reach her eyes at all. "I wanted to offer you something, a choice, presented in advance, before things become complicated." She paused, letting the pause do work. "The ceremony will take place, and its outcome is not in doubt. The Vielle bloodline has participated in the court for generations, and our position here is a matter of history and record and considerable institutional weight. Whatever the ancient texts suggest about dormant bloodlines and recognition responses, what matters at the level of political reality is documentation and standing and the support of the council, none of which are things that an assistant archivist with an undocumented lineage has access to." Another pause. "What I am offering you is the opportunity to step back from a situation that will cause you harm. I am offering it because I believe you are an intelligent woman who deserves the opportunity to make a wise decision before events make it for you." Sarah held Isadora's gaze and thought about all the things she could say, and about the careful, self-protective discipline that had governed her choices for so many years, and about the panther bowing its head in the candlelight, and about her own hand rising without her permission toward something that had already known her name. "Thank you for the tea," she said. "It was lovely." She left and did not look back, and went directly to the king's study and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, as he always did, and when she finished, there was a silence that was different from the silences that had preceded it, heavier and more directed, and when he spoke, his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something that was not quite anger because it was too controlled for that, but was anger's more dangerous cousin. "She threatened you," he said. "She offered me a choice," Sarah said. "She was very polite about it." "She threatened you," he said again, and it was not a question this time. Sarah looked at him and decided that this was the moment, if there was going to be one, for the precision she had promised herself in the archive 11 days ago, when she had first understood what was happening. "Your Majesty," she said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly, because I cannot make a wise decision about the next 3 weeks without knowing the answer." "Ask," he said. "What does the blood-binding ceremony mean for you, personally, as opposed to politically? Because those are 2 different questions, and they have 2 different answers. And I have been treating them as one question, and I think that has been a mistake." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him consider the question with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And she thought that she had never seen a powerful person consider a personal question carefully before answering it, and that she found the quality more disarming than almost anything else about him. "Politically," he said, "the ceremony is a mechanism that the council has been using to pressure me toward a formal mating choice for 2 years. Isadora's request for it this season was partly strategic, designed to force my hand in a public forum where refusal becomes impossible." He paused. "Personally, I believe the ceremony does what the old record says it does. I believe the old magic is real. I believe my panther has been trying to tell me something for 6 months that I was not willing to hear, because what it was telling me complicated everything I had arranged carefully and deliberately over 8 years of governance, and I am not a man who finds it easy to accept complication." He stopped. He looked at her. "And I believe," he said more quietly, "that the reason my panther has not been controllable since the night it first caught your scent from 3 floors above the archive, which is when this began, is that it has considerably less patience with political necessity than I do, and it was not willing to wait for me to figure out what it had already figured out the moment it found you. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on." Sarah sat with that for a moment. She was aware that her heart was doing something that was medically speaking quite dramatic, and she was aware that her expression had probably changed in ways she was no longer fully controlling, and she was aware that 3 years of careful invisibility were in the process of becoming something else entirely. Not disappearing, but transforming. The way things transform when they stop being strategies and start being choices. "I think," she said, "that I need to tell you what I found in the final section of the translation. The part about what happens when a dormant Sarah bloodline activates during the ceremony." "Tell me," he said. "It does not activate quietly," she said. "The record is quite specific about that. The old magic does not simply indicate recognition in such a case. It responds. It responds to the dual inheritance in the carrier, in a way that is, according to the scribe, both unmistakable and permanent. And the word he uses in the old tongue is one that I spent 3 days verifying, because I wanted to be certain I was reading it correctly." She met his eyes. "The word means awakening. Not recognition. Awakening." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She watched him process this, watched the precise, careful machinery of his thinking work through the implications. And then she watched something else happen in his expression. Something that the machinery did not usually allow through. Something that looked like relief. "Then we go to the ceremony," he said. "We go to the ceremony," she agreed. The midwinter gathering arrived with the particular grandeur that the Obsidian Palace reserved for events of political and supernatural significance, which meant that every hall was lit with twice its normal complement of candles, and every surface that could be draped in silver-shot fabric had been, and every person in attendance had, worn their most carefully calculated version of their best self. The great hall had been transformed into something that moved between beautiful and overwhelming, its vaulted ceiling reflecting the light of 1,000 candles in shifting patterns that made the air itself seem alive, and the gathered court stood in their arranged groupings with the particular charged stillness of people who have been told that something significant is about to occur, and have had long enough to think about what that might mean for them personally. Sarah stood at the back. She had dressed simply, in the deep green of a staff member attending a formal function, which she was technically still doing, and she had arranged her dark hair in its customary plain style, and she had put on the small silver earrings that had been her mother's, and that she wore on occasions that required her to feel like herself, rather than like a function she was performing. She was aware of Isadora across the room, resplendent in white and silver, positioned at the precise center of the eligible court females who had been arranged near the sacred vessel, with the kind of geometrical intention that announced its own architecture. She was aware of various members of the council in their formal positions, watching everything with the assessment of people who have invested their political futures in specific outcomes. She was aware of the king, at the far end of the hall, in the formal black of the Draven line with the silver circlet of the ruling house resting against his dark hair, speaking with his chancellor with the controlled composure of someone managing 17 things simultaneously. She was also aware, with a certainty that sat below all other awareness like bedrock, that she was shaking very slightly, and that the shaking had nothing to do with the cold. The ceremony began with the formal announcements, which were conducted by the high ceremonial, an elderly male lichen of enormous dignity, who had apparently been performing this function for 40 years, and had the specific, practiced gravity of someone who has learned to imbue ritual with weight by the quality of his own believing in it. He described the history of the blood binding. He described its purpose and its mechanism. He described, in the old formal language that was still used for sacred occasions, the nature of the vessel and the old magic that governed it. And the hall was very quiet while he spoke, the kind of quiet that collects around things that are larger than the people gathered to witness them. The vessel itself stood on a plinth of black stone at the center of the room. It was not impressive, physically, which Sarah had noted when she first saw it carried in earlier in the evening. A bowl of ancient silver, worn to smoothness by centuries of handling, unremarkable except for the faint luminescence that lived in the metal, visible only if you were looking for it, a quality of light that should not have been there and was. She understood now, having translated the document that described its origins, what she was looking at. She understood it differently than everyone else in the room understood it, and the difference was not comfortable. The eligible females began to approach the vessel, in the formal order prescribed by rank. Isadora was positioned to go last, a choice that Sarah recognized as strategic, because going last meant that if the vessel had not responded to anyone before her, the weight of accumulated silence would make her own moment more significant, and if it had responded to someone else, she would have had time to observe and potentially intervene. Each woman approached. Each woman made the small, ritual cut on her palm with the ceremonial knife. Each woman let the blood fall to the vessel. The vessel received each offering with silence, and the silence accumulated in the hall, and the air grew heavier with the weight of it, and Sarah watched from the back of the room and did not breathe. Isadora approached the vessel last. She was perfectly composed, perfectly graceful, perfectly everything that 3 decades of preparation had made her, and she made the cut with the clean precision of someone who has practiced it, and she held her palm over the vessel, and her blood fell. The vessel was silent. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had a texture of shock in it, A collective held breath as the hall registered what had happened, or rather what had not happened. And Sarah watched Isadora's composure hold through training alone, because the thing beneath the composure was something sharp and disbelieving, and for the first time, genuinely afraid. The high ceremonial looked up from the vessel. He looked out at the assembled hall, and then he said, in the formal old tongue that everyone present could understand, "The vessel has not recognized. Is there another who would approach?" Sarah had not planned to move. That is what she would think later. Looking back, which was perhaps not entirely true in the way that we are never entirely honest about the moments when we choose something irrevocable, because we prefer the story of inevitability to the story of decision. She moved. She walked from the back of the hall through the gathered court, with the particular steadiness of someone who has been invisible for so long that the experience of being seen is less frightening than she expected. Because she has been invisible for so long that she has learned, without knowing she was learning it, that her worth is not a function of whether anyone is looking. The crowd parted for her. She was aware of this, distantly, as she walked, aware of the faces turning, aware of Isadora's pale gray gaze finding her across the room with an expression that had moved entirely past composure, aware of the council members whose expressions had moved through confusion towards something more uncertain, aware of the king at the far end of the hall, who was not surprised, who was watching her walk toward the vessel with those amber gold eyes that did not look away and did not need to. She took the ceremonial knife from the high ceremonial's hands. She made the cut on her palm, which hurt in the precise small way that a cut hurts, immediate and real, and she held her palm over the ancient silver bowl, and her blood fell. The vessel did not simply respond. It blazed. Silver-white light poured from it in a column that reached the vaulted ceiling, and the hall filled with a sound that was not a sound but a vibration, ancient and resonant, the kind of thing that lives in the bones rather than the ears, and the warmth that Sarah felt moving up her arm from her bleeding palm was not warmth as she had known it before. Not the warmth of fire or sunlight, but the warmth of something waking up that had been asleep for a very long time, and was finding, as it opened its eyes, that everything was exactly as it had expected. She heard the gasps. She heard the hall breaking open around her. She was aware, distantly, of the light that was coming from her own hands, from her own skin, which was a startling development she had not entirely anticipated despite the translation being quite clear about it, silver white and warm and spreading up her arms in slow pulsing waves that moved with her heartbeat. She was aware of the panther that had appeared from somewhere at the edges of the room, padding through the stunned crowd without touching anyone, making directly for her with the same calm, inevitable movement it had made through the lower archive corridor weeks ago, and of the way the crowd parted for it with a speed and totality that was almost graceful. The panther stopped beside her. It was so close that she could feel its warmth against her side, and it pressed its enormous head against her hip with the same quiet, certain gesture it had used in the archive, and the light that was moving through. Her responded to the contact, brightening and then settling, the way something excited settles when it has been confirmed, when it has been told yes. This is correct. This is where you are supposed to be. She looked up. The king was walking toward her through the hall, and the court was parting for him too, and his amber gold eyes were on her face with an expression that was nothing like his public composure, and everything like the man she had sat across a desk from for 3 weeks of evenings, that had quietly, without her permission, become the best part of her understanding of herself. He stopped in front of her. The panther sat between them, tall enough that its head was nearly level with Sarah's chest, and it looked from one to the other with the satisfaction of someone who has been trying to explain something for 6 months and has finally been understood. The light from the vessel was still present, quieter now, a steady luminescence that touched everything in the hall with the quality of the old magic acknowledging itself. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was grateful for, because the rest of her was not. "Sarah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the formal title that preceded it in all their evenings of translation work. And the way he said it told her that this was also a choice, deliberate and specific, and that he understood what he was choosing. The high ceremonial was saying something behind her. Something formal and ancient and ceremonially significant. And the hall was full of sound and movement, and the particular energy of a moment that everyone present understands will be spoken of for a very long time. She heard almost none of it. She was looking at the king, at Kale, who was looking back at her with those eyes that she had first seen in a black furred face, bowed in a candlelit corridor. And she thought that the Panther had known before either of them was willing to admit it, and that maybe the oldest and wildest parts of things always do. "I want to tell you something," he said, low enough that it was only for her, underneath the noise of the hall. "Before the council begins making decisions, and before Isadora begins making alternative arrangements, and before the next several weeks become something that will require a great deal of careful navigation." "Tell me," she said. "I am glad it was you," he said. "Not because of the lineage or the ceremony or what it means for the political situation. I am glad it was you because of who you are. Because you are honest when honesty costs something, and precise when imprecision would be easier, and brave in the particular way of people who have learned that their courage is their own, rather than a response to anyone else's expectations." He paused. "I have been ruling this kingdom for 8 years, and I have been alone in every room I have ever been in. And for the last 3 weeks, I have not been." Sarah was quiet for a moment. The light in her skin pulsed gently with her breathing. The Panther leaned its warm weight against her side. The hall moved and sounded around them, but it was distant, held back by the particular quality of a moment that has its own gravity. "I need you to know something," she said. "I did not come here because of the ceremony. I came because a Panther bowed to me in the lower archive, and I could not pretend I did not know what it meant." "I know," he said. "And I need you to know," she continued, "that I am not going to become someone easier to manage simply because the political situation would benefit from it." "I know that too," he said, and something in the line of his mouth moved toward the very dry humor she had found so unexpectedly, privately delightful. "I am counting on it." She looked at him, this man who ruled with precision, and had been alone in every room, and she thought about the Panther that had escaped its chains and run with the unerring instinct of something that knows where it is going even when the person it belongs to does not. And she thought that maybe the wildest parts of things are not the parts that need to be controlled, but the parts that know. Before reason arrives, what reason will eventually have to concede? She took a step toward him. She raised her right hand, the one that still carried some faint warmth from 3 weeks ago when it had risen without her decision, and she pressed it flat against the center of his chest, where his heartbeat was steady and present and real. His hand came up and covered hers, and the light from her skin moved between them with the patient, warm certainty of something that has been waiting a very long time to do exactly this. Behind them, the vessel still glowed. Around them, the court watched in the silence of people witnessing something larger than politics, and older than any of the rules they had spent their lives following. The high ceremonial finished his ancient proclamation. The council members began the particular kind of murmuring that precedes the reorganization of everything. And Isadora Vielle, on the far side of the hall, straightened her shoulders and set her pale gray eyes to a middle distance with the expression of a woman who has lost a battle and is already, in the same breath, calculating the terms of the new landscape, which Sarah noted with the small, precise part of her mind that was always watching, and filed carefully away, because this was not a woman who would stop simply because one plan had failed, and the next several weeks were indeed going to require careful navigation. But that was for later. That was for the next thing. And there would always be a next thing. And she had lived her whole life in the knowledge that there would always be a next thing, and had learned to stand in the present moment anyway, to inhabit it fully, rather than spending it in anticipation of what came after. Right now, she was standing in the great hall of the Obsidian Palace, with her hand against the king's heart, and her blood on the ancient silver vessel, and the panther pressed warm and certain against her side, and the light that lived in her skin was pulsing in steady time with the heartbeat under her palm, and the old magic was quiet and present and content, the way things are content when they have finally accomplished what they set out to do. And Sarah, who had spent 3 years cataloging records that no one read, who had made herself invisible in a world that was not built for her, who had stood alone in a candlelit corridor and refused to run from something the whole world would have told her to run from, was something she had not been in longer than she could easily remember. She was found, not by the ceremony, not by the politics or the prophecy, or the ancient magic of bloodlines that survived their own extinction through patience and silence, and the willingness of ordinary people to carry something extraordinary without knowing what they were carrying. She had been found by an animal that did not know how to lie, that had escaped its chains and run with the whole compass of its ancient nature pointing true, and had stopped in a candle-lit archive and bowed its head to a woman who had not run, and she thought that this was the truest version of how the most important things happen, not in ceremony, not in proclamation. In a quiet room, in the dark, with the oldest and most honest part of something finding its way to the one place it needed to be. She breathed. The panther breathed. The king's heart beat under her hand, and the midwinter light in the great hall of the Obsidian Palace was warm and steady, and entirely, finally, real. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?